And I think so. The thing that really interested me, and this has been true of the last couple of cycles, and relates very much to this point about why Labour's vote is a bit lower than one might expect, is the rise of the Green Party. They are doing extremely well, and it hasn't been discussed very much. In the sort of media in the way that the rise of Reform has been discussed, because it's not quite so visible in national polls, but across two sets of general elections now, they've really added a lot of councillors. If you look at the set of councils we had last week, it was they now have a third as many councillors as the Tories in those councils, which is kind of remarkable for a party that has never had that strong a council base in the country before. And they're coming sort of second. They're sort of the biggest party in some quite big councils like Bristol. What do you think? I think we all agree that's not going to be replicated exactly in a general election, and that's one of the reasons why you can't compare local and general election results so easily. But what does it presage for Labour? What does this sort of rise in Green strength in local elections tell us about how the electorate are now behaving and thinking?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think I agree with you. It's one of the most under-discussed stories in not just this local election cycle, but the last 3 or 4 local election cycles. I think in every write-up of local elections I've done since 2019, I've had at least a paragraph where I've said, well, this is another strong set of local elections for the Greens. Something seems to be happening here. So this isn't a flash in the pan. It's been going on for a number of years. It's also very clear what the kind of political sociology of this Green support is. I mean, they are picking up some votes in Conservative areas. It's worth pointing that out. But, they do best in Labour areas. They do best in graduate areas. They do best in Remain areas. They do best in urban areas. We can see what this is. It's a challenge to Labour on its progressive left flank. And it's a challenge that now has a serious and credible base in local governments. So I do think that round about a year or two from now, if you're continuing, I don't know if you still call it the power test once they actually are in government. If we're doing this in May 2026, we'll be like, oh my goodness, look at all these Green councillors all the way across these Labour councillors. What does this mean? Is it going to pull Starmer to the left and so on? And there'll be a lot of people who've ignored this in parts of the press who are getting very, very worked up about Reform. Who'll be like, oh my God, what's happened here? This is new. But it's not actually. It's been going on for a while. And what I think it does point to, which we also see in the opinion polling and the political science surveys and stuff like this, is the left, as we conceive it now, is a much less partisan left than it used to be. It's a broad tent, a big tent that includes a lot of people whose relationship to the Labour Party is much more transactional than emotional. These are not partisan Labour voters. These are voters who are going to be willing to consider other options. We know they're going to be willing to consider other options because they are actively endorsing other options in other elections already. And I think that will pose probably a steadily growing problem for Starmer once he's in government, because right now we're at a very, very anti-incumbent moment in the cycle. And another thing we saw in the locals is, people are the tactical voting levels are really, really high, and this is true of Green voters as well. The Greens do much worse where they're, where it's a Conservative-held ward with Labour or the Lib Dems second. Greens do worse, which suggests they're piling in behind whoever the local challenger is. But once the Conservatives are out of government, that anti-incumbent dynamic, I suspect, will dissipate quite quickly. And these voters who are already telling us in local elections, you know what, we prefer what the Greens have to offer to what Keir Starmer has to offer. I don't think it's going to take very long for a lot of them to start saying the same thing in general election opinion polling and in by-elections and in local elections to come.
So just to, I suppose, be the kind of slightly annoying punter in all of this, I totally hear what you're saying, and I interviewed the Greens on my show, and they were making exactly this point. I suppose what a lot of people, though, think, a lot of people who are not in the kind of weeds of all the data and following all the kind of councils like you two are, is, well, look, it's highly unlikely that the Greens are going to win loads of seats at the general election. They're a great destination point at a local election if you're kind of pissed off with Labour and you don't want to vote for the Tories. Caroline Lucas is probably the best known Green in the country. She's stepping down at the next general election. Isn't it the case that one of the reasons the Greens gets less coverage is because people don't feel they can inflict that much damage at this stage when it matters at a parliamentary election, whereas people think Reform can do the Tories a lot of damage?
Yeah, I think that's true, and to be honest, I largely agree with that assessment. I think there's a paradox about both the Greens and Reform. So Greens did much better than Reform in these local elections, but as you say, the threat they pose at the general election, it's not really there, and I think that's one way in which people are making a rational inference from these local elections to the general election. Whereas Reform, very weak in many respects, underperformed on some indicators in these local elections, but because the Conservatives' vote is so low now, and because they're so exposed to a challenge on their kind of Brexity anti-immigration right, they punch way above their weight in the general election. So the attention being on the latter at this point makes a lot of sense. But I think what is important and new about where we are now, with the Greens having quadrupled the number of councillors they have on the councils up and down the country in the past 5 years, is you've got a real prospect of them taking a bunch of councils from Labour in the coming Labour Parliament, a real prospect of them being a major headache at by-elections. And I don't think we have any real precedent for what that will mean.